I've spent my entire life in my hometown. It's where I was born, where I grew up, and is probably where I will die. To some people, this sounds like a miserable existence, but honestly, I don't think I'd have it any other way. My town had an industrial boom once, but that time came and went long before I was ever born. Only the old-timers remember that era now, and even then, most of them were only around for the tail end of it. The rest of us only know this town for what it has since become, a ghost of its former self, marred by the rusting titan of a bygone age that now looms over our home like a dead sentinel, its hollow body a symbol of what once was and what will never be again. Our town rests in that immense shadow now, aching and pleading to once again feel the sunlight that will forever be obscured by its past. But hey, it's home. My lifelong dedication to this town is what made me want to become a firefighter. I wanted to give back to the community that shaped me, and the best way I could think to do this was to join the local fire department. That was going on 20 years ago now, and in that time I've seen and experienced things, both on and off the job, that most people would struggle to believe. But I guess that comes with the territory of living in a cursed town. Everybody who lives here learns at a young age that something isn't right about this place. One day you become old enough to realize that other towns you visit aren't quite like the one you call home. They don't carry that familiar layer of darkness that seems to envelop you like a blanket every time you cross back over our town's borders after spending time away. Other towns don't feel like they're perpetually cold and cloudy, even on hot summer days. They don't come with that overwhelming sense that they should have passed into the realm of forgotten history generations ago, but are kept alive by a stubborn populace that refuses to move away and leave them in the past. Most outsiders who visit the town can often feel this shift right away, and usually with greater intensity, since they're not properly acclimated by years spent beneath the town's oppressive weight. It's for this reason that visitors typically try to stay in the town for as little time as possible, and why any moving trucks that come here tend to arrive empty. Some people say the town has been like this since the beginning of time, destined to inherit its curse since before it was even brought into existence all those many years ago. Others say it acquired the curse through some horrible event, and that it was once just like any other forgettable American small town. I don't know which theory I subscribe to. On one hand, I can't see why this land would be so infested with evil for no discernible reason. But on the other, it's difficult to see the town as anything other than the source of malice and misery that I've always known it to be. The least popular belief of the bunch is that the town isn't cursed at all, and that all of the misfortunes herein are merely the spawn of cruel coincidence. There are fewer and fewer followers of this model every year, and soon it will likely go completely extinct. When searching for the specific occurrence that kicked off the town's long string of woes, many of those who believe in Theory B point to an incident that occurred at the turn of the 20th century. Those who follow Theory A merely see this event as a symptom of the much older rot that infests this place. Either way, both agree that the event in question is directly connected to the darkness that lives here. It happened in the old coal mine, which at the time was one of the major pillars of the town's economy. A terrible fire broke out in the mine, the source of which is still debated to this day. The inferno turned the wooden supports above the miners' heads to ash and caused several collapses inside of the main shaft. 11 miners were trapped inside for 4 long days while the townsfolk worked tirelessly to dig through the rubble in order to rescue them. By the time they had reached the miners, all 11 of them were dead. 5 of them had suffocated, slain by the toxic air and rancid smoke created by the raging blaze, while 3 of them were crushed in the shaft collapse. The bodies of the remaining 3, however, were never found. It is still speculated as to what became of them, and everybody who you ask has their own theory. I'll allow you to come up with your own. The collapse that had doomed those miners also did the same thing to the fire, smothering the blaze so that by the time the townsfolk made it into the collapsed shaft, all that remained of the terrible inferno was a few dying embers. despite little damage actually being done to the mine itself, it never managed to recover from this disastrous event. Any attempts to reopen it were met with further tragedy. More inexplicable fires broke out, and any new shafts excavated quickly collapsed, often entombing fresh victims in a coffin of furious earth. More strange were the miners who continued to vanish without a trace, much like the three who had disappeared during that initial devastation. There were reports of men disappearing mid-conversation with their constituents, who turned away for a mere moment to take a sip of water or wipe sweat from their brows, only to turn back and see that their companions were gone, seemingly plucked out of space or dragged into the nearby darkness without so much as a sound. Eventually, all of the miners, understandably scared for their lives, wound up moving on to new work, and the town could not find anybody willing to replace them. After years of attempts to rehabilitate the mine, it was finally shut down for good, thus rendering one of the town's main economic stimulants officially deceased. But though the mine is abandoned and in disuse, that does not mean it remains inactive. Random fires spring up in that mine at least once a year, despite it remaining empty and free of any activity that would potentially cause such ignitions. In the interest of preventing our town from becoming another Centralia, our department, as well as all those in the surrounding area, work together to extinguish these blazes as they come up. The town has an entire task force in place that monitors the mine for fire activity, and when any is spotted, they immediately dispatch us to the scene. Sometimes we manage to put out the blaze in a few minutes. Other times we spend hours battling the fresh inferno that seems intent on taking the entire town with it into the deepest pits of ruin. At this point, I feel like I have some kind of sixth sense that allows me to anticipate the mine calls a couple of days in advance. I get a tightness in my stomach that continues to twist like an old wind-up toy until it finally snaps. Despite seeing it coming, it ruins my day all the same when that call comes in over dispatch. I hate returning to that horrible place. The invisible miasma of suffering that I feel in there is sometimes strong enough to make me nauseous within a matter of minutes, and I always get the strange sense that there is something watching me from somewhere deeper in the cavern. Every time we're there, I fully expect to turn away from one of my companions for a mere moment, only to turn back and find that they have disappeared. The charged hose line they were handling, now dancing crazily on the dirty ground as it violently discharges water without guidance or reason. This hasn't ever happened, but that doesn't mean that it never will. It could even end up being me that gets spirited away into the wanting gloom, dragged by some unseen force that doesn't even award me the luxury of a final scream. I suppose only time will tell. Practitioners of Theory B who present the mine disaster as the source of the town's curse purport that something old and evil was dug up from the earth on that fateful day well over a century ago, and while I am not entirely sold on such a tale, I admit that it's hard to argue against it considering all that I've experienced down there. That mine is a dark, hellish place, and I shudder to think that anywhere in this world could embody so much natural animosity. It's strangely more comforting to think that some event kick-started the decades of concentrated malice that radiate from it, instead of believing that such putrid energy has been there from the start. Maybe an evil contained within the oldest stones of this planet, since time immemorial, isn't much better than that same presence being free from the start. But clearly there is enough of a distinction there that it's created a schism between the townsfolk, so I suppose it does make some kind of difference in the minds of the people. But the mine isn't the only place of great and concentrated misfortune in this town, and thus is not the only potential source for the curse that Option B folk point to. I'd be remiss not to also talk about the old steel mill, which, while now long empty, used to work in tandem with the mine in order to fuel this town's former prosperity, much like how the mine fueled the mill's once hot furnaces. It saddens me to think that those same furnaces will never know such heat again. The mill, once a thriving colossus of its day, suffered greatly following the mine incident. Without a constant flow of coal coming in from the mine, the mill's productivity began to slow. Coal, much like the ore that was refined within the mill, began coming in from other mines in the area. This kept the mill afloat for a few more good decades, but it also made operating the mill more expensive. And as money and resources dried up, so too did the prosperity that this great mastodon of its age had once enjoyed. The mill managed to chug along at a decent pace until the mid-1950s, when its viability finally ran out. By then, the town had long since given up its dream of returning to the height of its industrial glory, but nobody wanted to tell that to the old mill. They allowed the poor thing to continue believing it made a difference right up until the very end. Further tragedy struck on the mill's final day of operation. A disgruntled mill worker, devastated and desperate from the news of the mill's closure, forced his way into the foreman's office and gunned the man down without so much as a word. The mill worker slew 4 more of his peers before he was finally subdued. He would never see the inside of a jail cell for his barbaric act. His fellow mill workers, riled into a cocktail of rage, took turns attacking the unarmed and defeated man. They beat him so badly that he perished right there on the office floor. It's unknown if his killers were ever prosecuted for what they did. This final act in the mill's long tenure seems to have marked it as a place of darkness that rivals that of the mine. In the years that followed its closure, rumors persisted that the empty old structure became a place of devil worship and depraved acts of unspeakable sin. Whether or not these events ever did or still do take place is unclear, but this doesn't stop us from getting called out to the mill several times a year. Usually we're there to investigate a recurring and mysterious burning smell, only for us to arrive and find that the mill's old furnaces are as cold as ever. First responders that have been called to the mill over the years have reported that they've seen dark figures of shadow and subtly shifting silhouettes deep within the bowels of the old building. I've personally heard strange, mechanical noises echoing through the mill's ghostly, abandoned passageways, and have sworn to everybody I've told this to that I once heard the rattling report of a gunshot coming from the direction of what was once the foreman's office. There are those who believe that the victims of that tragic day, including the murderer himself, continue to work an endless shift in their old place of employment, even though operations there came to an end many decades ago. Some townsfolk leave them containers of food and thermoses of coffee at the mill's entrance, only to return the next day to find these vessels emptied of their contents. While I can't confidently say that I know who is enjoying these free meals, I highly doubt there is a person in town who would dare to steal food from those old mill workers. The misfortunes of the town are not isolated to these 2 sepulchres of the past. While the mine and the mill only see occasional activity, there are other goings-on in this town that affect the townsfolk much more frequently, and in turn, affect my department more frequently as well. Everybody who lives in the town, without exception, gets into at least one automobile accident per year. Most of these are small fender benders, which is the kind of accident that everybody prays for. Some of them are significantly worse. The worst ones are the ones that we have to respond to, and they often aren't pretty. The plus side to this is that everybody in town is incredibly friendly and understanding at the scene of a collision. 2 guys back into each other while pulling out of their parking spaces at the grocery store. They laugh it off and may even buy each other a beer that night as a way of saying thanks for being their accident that year. An old woman sideswipes a young man's car and takes out his driver's side mirror. Well, hey, at least his arm wasn't sticking out of the window at the time. Everybody's cars are perpetually dinged up, and insurance rates in our town are through the roof. But people are just happy when their accident turns out to be relatively minor. Of course, there are those few unfortunates who wind up in 2 accidents in a year, which really is a testament to their bad luck more than it is to the town's curse. There's always that nagging feeling in the back of your mind after you've been in what you believe to be your accident. Was this actually my accident for the year, or am I going to be severely disappointed in a few months? Some people arrive at an unfortunate answer to this question down the line. A rather large river runs through the heart of town. Once a key waterway for shipping ore and metals in and out of town, it has become much more of a liability in the decades since that industry's demise. Any and all rain can and often does lead to severe and sudden flooding, resulting in many residents being trapped if they're anywhere near the river when some unexpected bad weather hits. It is for this reason that our fire department requires that members have several different water rescue certifications under their belt, because they're definitely going to need them. We pull dozens of people out of the water every year. Many of them are still alive when we do it. An old, neglected railroad track stretches along the outskirts of town, extending for untold miles in two directions as it passes through the seemingly endless expanse of dense, dark forest that surrounds our town on all sides. The track hasn't been in use for going on 30 years now, not since they created the new line that passes through all the bigger and more important communities to the north. But that doesn't stop creatures from showing up in dead, gore-strewn heaps on or near the tracks on a semi-regular basis. Deer are usually mostly intact, but smaller animals like foxes and raccoons are lucky if we're able to tell what species they are based on the carcass they leave behind. Nobody can properly explain how these animals suffer such violent deaths in such close proximity to the abandoned tracks. But the popular legend is that there's a phantom train still running back and forth along the line at night, never able to reach its destination, but also not able to return to where it began. Sometimes it even comes to a stop, and if you climb aboard, you're whisked away to the land of the departed, never to be seen by any of us again until the day we step beyond the threshold of death. I suppose this is preferable to the alternative encounter you could have with such a train. I've seen what that thing can do, and it's not a pretty sight, especially not when the victim has a familiar face. Disease seems to spread exceptionally easily here. A simple strain of the common cold can knock half of the community out of commission for several weeks, and has the power to halt life in town for long stretches of time in the colder months. Drive through town on a random week in February, and you'd think we had abandoned the place like we already should have done a long time ago. There have been a number of times where the fire department has been stripped to a mere fraction of its normal workforce, thanks to a particularly stubborn infestation of flu that decides to linger in our station for upwards of a month. In these situations, we pretty much all end up catching it. The most debilitated by the disease get to take some time off to recover, but those of us whose immune systems put in overtime are rewarded by getting to work some overtime of our own, all while trying to convince ourselves that we're not about to keel over at any minute from the agony of the disease that we're just barely able to fight off. The mine hasn't been quite cruel enough to set itself ablaze during one of these bouts of illness, at least not while I've been working at the department, and I pray that it never develops enough of a malevolent streak to test such a thing out. I'm not exaggerating when I say that such an occurrence could easily spell the end for our little town. Death is a large part of life here. Without looking up any statistics, I'm willing to bet that we bury at least twice as many dead each year as any of the nearby towns, all of which are double our size. Demise comes in many forms here. There are a surprisingly high number of ways that a life can be lost in a town this relatively small. There are the expected deaths, the kind of things that the town macabrely anticipates each year, like drownings during river floods or folks perishing in an especially bad yearly car accident. But there are plenty of strange and mysterious deaths that nobody is able to wrap their head around. Being a firefighter, I've witnessed the aftermath of a good number of these strange deaths myself, and have spent more nights than I can count falling asleep while trying to solve their unsolvable mysteries in my troubled mind. Folks have returned home to find their healthy loved ones sitting at the kitchen table, midway through a meal that they will never finish, their deaths seeming to have come simply because the reaper was having a slow day. Grocery store workers have gone missing for the better part of a week, only to be found wide-eyed and blue, trapped in a freezer that had been used countless times in the days since their absence, and from which food had been placed on shelves and then subsequently purchased by customers. tiny, loving lapdogs that don't even seem physically capable of harming another living creature, have suddenly snapped for just long enough to bury their little teeth into their owners' necks, hitting just the right spot to make their victims bleed out within a matter of minutes. Death comes for everybody here, young and old and sick and healthy alike. Most of the time it strikes at random, but it does follow a few recognizable patterns that everybody in town recognizes and accepts. Without going into detail, I'll say this. There is a reason that people in this town try not to grow too attached to their firstborn children. I could go on. I could tell you every single detail of every single strange occurrence in this town. But if I haven't managed to convince you that it's cursed by now, then I doubt that I'm going to. I was never really trying to convince anybody of anything by sharing these stories in the first place. My goal was just to highlight a place largely forgotten by time, but still very much deserving of recognition, both for all that it has endured over the generations, as well as for all that it has accomplished. And though these accomplishments might remain cold and buried beneath a dark and heavy past, the pride that they inspire is still very much present in all who live here. There is a reason that so many of us who live in this town are lifers, and it's not just because the economic downturn in this region has made it difficult for people to escape it. There are plenty of folks here who wouldn't leave the town, curse and all, if given the chance, and I count myself among them. That very well could be the curse itself talking. It's possible that it's so deeply rooted within our minds and souls and culture that it tricks us into thinking that we actually enjoy living in this miserable little corner of America. But if this is the case, then I have no intention of fighting it. My town is certainly not an easy place to live in. Something lurks here, something festers, and it likes to remind us all that it's here with us. But like I said earlier, this town is still home. For the last couple of days, I've been getting that familiar twisting in my gut again, the one that warns me of a coming fire down in the old mine. We haven't had one yet this year, so we're definitely overdue. If people are interested, maybe after the fire I can share more stories about my town, assuming the thing that is in the mine doesn't actually take me this time. But in the meantime, I'll leave you with something that's been on my mind lately and what actually encouraged me to share these stories in the first place. I had the upsetting realization recently that someday, maybe someday relatively soon, my town is going to be gone. It's going to be forgotten. Someday it will be abandoned, either because the economy took too great of a tumble, or the mine fire finally became too great for us to combat, or simply because that one last stubborn holdout of a resident finally decided that putting up with this dying place just wasn't worth the effort anymore. Regardless of how it goes down, I know the simple truth is that we likely won't be here forever. So I just ask that you do your best to remember the places and the people that the world has forgotten about. Do your best to keep their memory alive in some way, because despite every hardship that the curse inflicts on this town, I still believe the worst thing that could ever happen to it would be if nobody even remembers that it was ever here at all.